Okay, well, I'm Kathleen Corley Terrio, and my mother was Toshiko Matsuo. My mother was born in Canada to parents who came over from Japan. There were 5 children in my mother's family. She was the second youngest girl. Actually, there were 6. There was a girl that was the oldest girl that was sent back to Japan to be schooled, and nobody ever, I guess they lost touch with her during the war, because I've never heard of her again. And I don't know what you want to know.
Well, I mean, maybe you could explain what happened to our family during the war and like how the Japanese were viewed in Canada during that time.
Okay. So my mother was quite young. I'm not sure how young. I think maybe about 13 or younger. And she had a brother who was very talented black belt judo. And he was very, very good at it. Because of that, he was a bit of a target. My mother lived in Haney, BC, which is now a suburb of Vancouver, or part of Vancouver. And they had a big farm. Well, maybe not a big farm, but they had a property that would be worth a lot of money right now. And my grandfather, besides farming, I think he used to do some logging. So when the war started, even before the war started, there was lots of prejudice towards the Japanese Canadians. And when the war started, it became a very bad thing to be Japanese, and there was all this talk about internment. And because my uncle was such a target because of his black belt judo skills, my grandfather decided that he would not wait for the final internment where they were taken and placed into internment, but he chose to go to, he was forced to, it's not a free choice, to go to Manitoba, from BC to Manitoba, where they lived on a sugar beet farm and kind of like slaves. I don't even know if they were paid anything, but they were not allowed to go into the city, which was Winnipeg. They weren't allowed to own radios. They were supposed to just stay on this isolated farm and not talk to any other Japanese people. So we lost this huge property in BC because it was just taken away from them and never returned to them. I think my grandparents ended up moving to Thunder Bay after the war ended. They must have come into Winnipeg and then moved to Thunder Bay.
Yeah.
My mother, who was a tiny, pretty little thing, met my dad, who was English, Irish, Canadian, and he was a union organizer, and he liked exotic things like my mom, so it was his second marriage, and he married her, and they had 6 children. And my mother never really talked about all that she had been through. We had to learn about it ourselves and through history books, and not Canadian history books, but through people, like I've bought in books regarding they call them the Nishi generation, so the firstborn, regarding their experiences. And it was especially bad for my mom because she married a white person, and so her parents didn't have a lot to do with her after she married a white person. She was always really close with her sister, Margaret, who married a army guy, and this army guy took her away to various towns, and they ended up living in Kingston, Ontario. And but my mother and her used to write long letters to each other, and Auntie Margaret's life didn't turn out so well. She also had 6 kids, but her husband was a violent alcoholic, and her health was not great. She had severe diabetes, and but they kept in close contact because the rest of their family married Japanese people or didn't marry at all.
Mm-hmm.
And the parents really didn't want to talk to them after they married white people.
Okay. So, what would you say, do you find for yourself growing up you had different experiences or were treated differently because of being half Japanese?
I don't recall ever being prejudiced against because I was half Japanese. My father was a Jehovah's Witness, and because we weren't allowed to pledge allegiance to Canada or sing the national anthem or even be in a classroom when the national anthem was being sung or God Save Our Queen was being sung, that caused me to be more of a target. Growing up, kids' racial jokes and insults were more prevalent than they are today. But, I mean, everybody was having them hurled at them. It wasn't like they'd always tell me, they'd pull their eyes up and down and go, Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, money please, which is kind of it's really, really bad when you think about it, but we had no idea what that meant at the time. And that was about as insulting as they got. But we had lots of friends, and it was a pretty multi-ethnic community growing up. One other thing that I do remember is that when my mother married my father, they moved in with his mother because they didn't have a lot of money. And my mother would be cooking with chopsticks, and as soon as someone like my grandmother or my father would enter the room, she'd put down the chopsticks and pick up a fork.
Oh.
So, like, she really, really tried to bury her heritage, and very quickly, she could no longer speak Japanese. And so, even though it was her mother tongue to begin with, she lost it because she totally didn't want to not associate her, but she wanted to lose that connection to her heritage.
And do you think that's just because of maybe pressures in the family and her husband and his mom, or due to the war at all?
Well, probably my father. My father loved her, the exoticness of her, but I don't think that he was really supportive in a way that, like, for example, that we encouraged you guys to speak and learn French. There was, I guess, it was just a different role back then. Like, he wasn't, I don't know, too interested, or, and I think it was more imposed by herself, the fact that her parents weren't speaking to her. She no longer saw her brothers for a long time. After her parents died, she did reconnect with her brothers. But no, I think it was more that she self-imposed it on herself.
Are there any ways you can remember that she self-imposed her attempt to, like, reject her Japanese heritage?
Well, besides never speaking her language, and not really talking about how awful that was to lose their property. She really didn't cook much Japanese food at all. When my Aunt Margaret would come and visit, but that could have been because my mother just wasn't really too interested in cooking. Like, she loved sewing and doing crafty stuff, and reading, and she would have been a career woman today.
Oh, okay.
She probably would never have had as many kids living in today's day.
Mm-hmm.
And but she wasn't really, one to sit home and clean the house. And when she could, she went out and worked, and in a hospital cafeteria,
Mm-hmm.
and that became her career. She eventually became the boss of the whole cafeteria, and
Oh.
she did quite well. And that's with no education, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, no, she wasn't really too keen on the Japanese experience. It's not like we had to. Later on in life, when movies like the geisha
Memoirs
girl,
of the Geisha.
yeah, she would have been interested to watch it, but not. It wasn't something that she was really fond of. But it's so interesting that you can lose your heritage within one generation.
Yeah.
Like you yourself can lose your heritage. And I don't think she really missed it,
Okay.
but like we were far more interested in it, and my dad was far more interested in it than she was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even didn't she change her name?
Well, I think that was forced on them. Like her name was Toshiko Claire Matsuo.
Mm-hmm.
And but like I don't ever remember her being embarrassed about her name.
Mm-hmm.
But I think back then, people that emigrated to Canada or that were born had to have like a Canadian name.
Oh,
I think
okay.
that was pretty common back then. It was that you had a Canadian name. That you didn't just keep your foreign-sounding name. But I missed the point of what you were asking about.
Well, I don't know. I was just asking.
Hmm. Which we all thought was beautiful. Like
Mhm.
her name, we all thought it was beautiful.
Yeah, it's a really nice name.
Hmm.
Nice. So is there anything else you might remember about being Japanese in Canada?
Like there are Japanese associations, and occasionally I'll see people who are Japanese, and we talk about, that shared heritage, especially for coming from there. But I've never felt ashamed or of being Japanese, and I've never felt that someone. Well, actually, I have felt some prejudice. For instance, one time I was out on the East Coast traveling, and we were on the East Coast of New Brunswick,
Mm-hmm.
and we went into this picture shop, and we saw these beautiful paintings of the Roche Percé,
Yeah.
and we were going to buy a painting, and we did buy a painting. And then as we were leaving, the guy started mentioning how he had been a prisoner in a Japanese war camp
Oh.
and how hard that was on him. And it was all in his biography, and
Mm-hmm.
we hadn't really known that, but I did not bring up the fact that I was half Japanese to him,
Yeah.
because that wouldn't have been very good. And then one time when I was quite young and I was working in a restaurant, and there was a dishwasher there, and he was Oriental. And at that point in my life, we didn't see that many Oriental people. So I used to say to people who were Oriental, I said, I'm not Japanese, what are you, right? And this guy happened to be Korean. And because of what had happened to the Japanese going into Korea, he hated Japanese people.
Oh.
And so it was really like he was not nice to me. And that was the first time I ever really experienced, but he was a recent immigrant from Korea, and not from a regular Canadian
Yeah.
point of view. No, I've always
Okay.
enjoyed the multicultural aspect of Canada,
That's
and
good.
that I'm part of it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You're
for your time
welcome.
with me.